What are the wider implications for war and peace in the region and the globe? Because we know we are in an age of interconnected theaters, and there was this whole talk of escalation leading to World War III. And the most critical question obviously is, are Israel and the Hezbollah, actually Israel in Lebanon and Iran, ready for peace? That is the most critical question for the Middle East, which runs about 30 kilometers north of the Israel-Lebanon border, is critical, because it is between the border and the river that it is proposed to create this buffer during this 60-day period. If the ceasefire holds, it may convert, as President Biden hopes, into a permanent cessation of hostilities. Russia has offered a qualified welcome to the ceasefire announcement, saying that it hopes that the agreement will actually be effective. तो हकीकत में क्या शांति बहाल होगी या नहीं? It is the Lebanese army, about 5,000 soldiers and US peacekeeping forces, who are to move south of the Litani River. In fact, the initial batches of the Lebanese army have already done so. They are to move south of the Litani River and enforce the ceasefire. This is obviously the biggest challenge. Will the ceasefire hold? That is, of course, the billion-dollar question. So viewers, friends, namaskar. The subject of today's episode is the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire. The Hezbollah, I am told, interestingly, has neither accepted nor rejected the ceasefire, whatever that ambiguity means. Now, the USA and France, backed by the European Union, after months of tortuous negotiations, have brokered a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon, effective with effect from 4 a.m. local time on 27th November 2024. So it's about 24 hours plus. Now this ceasefire took much of the world, may I add, by surprise. Very few were expecting it. The fighting between the Israelis and the Hezbollah, which began after the Hezbollah started firing into the northern areas of Israel in the immediate aftermath of 7th October 2023, you would recall, the day of the Hamas attack from Gaza on Israel. And essentially it was designed to put pressure on Israel to cease operations in Gaza. Now this fighting has seen over 3,700, almost 4,000 Lebanese and 140 Israelis killed. Now just a day before the ceasefire came into effect, 76 Lebanese were killed in brutal airstrikes in a 24-hour period, as if to suggest that it may be too soon to interpret the ceasefire as a definite de-escalation. The cities of Tyre and Nabatea in southern Lebanon have been gutted beyond recognition. The imagery is horrifying, to say the least. More than 100,000 houses, to include what the Israelis describe as controlled demolitions, demolishing those houses that they thought were being used by the resistance to target Israelis, have been razed to the ground. The sight of Lebanese returning to rubble and smoke, as you would have seen on your TV screens, is very disturbing indeed. Even by conservative estimates, the infrastructural losses and economic damages in this conflict over the last year, particularly over the last 2-3 months, are in the range of $8.5 billion. More than 70,000 Israelis have also been displaced from northern Israel on account of persistent Hezbollah rocket fire. So what are the principal features of the agreement? This agreement, which is very welcome, what are the principal features? What were the drivers behind the agreement? What led to the agreement? And of course, will the ceasefire hold? What are the wider implications for war and peace in the region and the globe? Because we know we are in an age of interconnected theaters, and there was this whole talk of escalation leading to World War III. And the most critical question obviously is, are Israel and the Hezbollah, actually Israel in Lebanon and Iran, ready for peace? That is the most critical question for the Middle East. So the principal features of the agreement. Well, the ceasefire is valid for 60 days, beginning 27th November, during which the IDF will carry out a phased withdrawal from southern Lebanon. So phased withdrawal of the IDF, even as during the same period, the Hezbollah moves with all its heavy weaponry to the north of the Litani River. Now this Litani River, which runs about 30 kilometers north of the Israel-Lebanon border, is critical because it is between the border and the river that it is proposed to create this buffer of about 30 kilometers from the border to the buffer, as I said, between Israel and the Hezbollah. Now that is the essence of the agreement. That is the essence of the agreement. If there are no infractions during this 60-day period, if the ceasefire holds, it may convert, as President Biden hopes, into a permanent cessation of hostilities. Given the history of the 2006, however, the precedent of a ceasefire, when a similar type of ceasefire under UN Security Council Resolution 1701 was breached repeatedly, there is obviously considerable skepticism. Will 1701 2.0 work? 1.0 didn't. Russia has offered a qualified welcome to the ceasefire announcement, saying that it hopes that the agreement will actually be effective. तो हकीकत में क्या शांति बहाल होगी या नहीं? Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has also welcomed the agreement while saying that he expects all sides, especially Israel, to fulfill their obligations towards maintaining peace on the ground. So considerable skepticism across the international arena. Within Israel, the reactions have also been mixed, highlighting a deepening divide amongst the political coalition. Netanyahu faces criticism from his own ranks, particularly from far-right Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who has said that a historic opportunity has been missed to finish the Hezbollah off, and therefore views the agreement as a blatant betrayal of Israeli security interests. Even, despite the differences, to perhaps put up a pro forma united front, the Cabinet Security Committee voted 10-1 in favor of the deal. Now, once IDF withdraws into on its own side of the border, and the Hezbollah moves north of the Litani River, it is the Lebanese army, about 5,000 soldiers and US peacekeeping forces, who are to move south of the Litani River. In fact, the initial batches of the Lebanese army have already done so. They are to move south of the Litani River and enforce the ceasefire. Now, this is obviously the biggest challenge, enforcement of the ceasefire. Thousands of Lebanese, of more than 1 million that were displaced from southern Lebanon, have already begun to return to their homes in southern Lebanon, where they have been greeted by unexploded bombs and closed military zones. Now, what the IDF has done, along a blue line about 7 kilometers from the border, it has declared these closed military zones and said that civilians cannot return because they fear, obviously, that Hezbollah operatives are weaving themselves into this crowd of returning displaced villagers and may cause trouble for the Israelis across the border. So, you see in the last 48 hours, there are already allegations of an Israeli airstrike, a drone strike, breaches of the ceasefire in the first 48 hours itself. So while there is a lot of hope, a lot of the nitty-gritty is still to play out in terms of the issues that I said. How do these Lebanese return? These closed military zones, how will it be enforced on ground? There are, as I said, reports of Israeli air and drone strikes. A Hezbollah member of parliament has already accused the IDF of firing at villagers returning to their homes. Israeli air patrols continue to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire. IDF ground troops continue to be positioned inland to respond to any violations. So that is, the principal tenets of the agreement and how it has played out in the last 48 hours. Now, what were the drivers behind the agreement? What led to the ceasefire? One, obviously, Israel was running out of ammunition and equipment. From AD interceptors to precision strike munitions, that is a reality. Israeli reservists, the people who were fighting, were fatigued after a year of intense fighting on two fronts, Hamas and Hezbollah. 54% of the reservists, I am told, had fought for more than the mandated 100 days in a year. So they were fatigued. In Prime Minister Netanyahu's own words, the IDF, for all the reasons I have said, deficits in ammunition, equipment, tiring manpower. So in the words of President Netanyahu, the IDF needed a breather. So this is in that sense a tactical pause, a breather. Then there were the obvious American leverages. I mean, the Americans wanted the Israelis to stop escalating, because as the campaign was escalating and this danger crept of a larger fight between Iran and Israel, there was the possibility, in fact it was already happening, of Russia getting sucked in, China getting sucked in, and then we would have the proxy war in Europe, in Ukraine, play out in West Asia, in the Middle East. So there were great dangers, and the Americans have exercised their leverage and perhaps persuaded Netanyahu into this ceasefire. There was also growing international pressure on Israel to end the war in view of the escalating civilian casualties. I mean, 46,000 or so in Gaza, many Lebanese, as I said, 4,000 here. So the escalating civilian casualties were a worry, and it is these pressures that led to securing an agreement. There is also, the driver of a Biden legacy in the fading days of his presidency. As he exits, he wants to leave a legacy behind, and what better way of fashioning peace in the Middle East. The ceasefire will also enable the 70,000 displaced Israelis to return to their homes in northern Israel. Now, there was great political pressure on Netanyahu. That was also an obvious driver towards this agreement. Though the mayors of many Israeli towns in northern Israel have criticized the deal, saying that they want stronger guarantees to keep the Hezbollah away from the border. So all kinds of complications, but those were some of the drivers behind the agreement. Will the ceasefire hold? That is, of course, the billion-dollar question. Hezbollah will definitely use the ceasefire to regenerate its operational capacities and revisit its operational doctrines. When it returns, will it return with these rocket fires, or will they have some other plans? They will thoughtfully think through these challenges, and we will see, some new doctrines, new ways of fighting, and of course they'll use this pause to beef up their operational capacities. For the time being, it appears that the Hezbollah will hunker down and rebuild for a future fight. Without doubt, the Hezbollah has been degraded considerably. I mean, it has lost 3 generations of its leadership, to include the very charismatic Hassan Nasrallah. And he is being sorely missed because he was a very charismatic leader, very shrewd and very astute. A large part of its rank and file has been eliminated because of the exploding pagers. Its missile arsenal and ammunition stocks have been degraded and severely depleted by repeated Israeli airstrikes. Its financial pipelines too have been attacked. We've seen all the infrastructure, the strikes on the infrastructure and the banks in southern and central Beirut. This is all, the attack on allied infrastructure which was behind Hamas. Yet, having said all this, I have no doubt, and most observers believe, that 80% of the Hezbollah capacities, 80% of them are still intact, and they continue to flourish underground, both north and south of the Litani River. Now, because they were underground, they have been beyond the reach and power of Israeli air power. So we have seen a lot of smoke, a lot of shelling, devastating strikes, but I think the central prowess of the Hezbollah, because it is in these underground tunnels both north and south of the Litani River, that is still intact. The Hezbollah's rocket arsenal has enough range to strike Israeli dispositions even from the north of the Litani River. We must remember this is no longer the Hezbollah only with the Katyusha rockets, which had a very limited range in 2006. Today's Hezbollah has a missile rocket force of far larger accuracy and reach, which means it can strike Israeli dispositions even from north of the Litani River. So the whole the operational framework has changed. Iranian military supplies to the Houthis, the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic Jihad, as also the Hezbollah will continue unabated. So all the other proxies are being continuously refueled by Iran. New routes and methodologies will be found to replenish the Hezbollah. Hezbollah is also likely to expand its operations to Syria, which is like the firm base for the Hezbollah to project its power into Israel. And so therefore it will expand, the Hezbollah will expand its operations to Syria to consolidate its operational and logistics posture. Netanyahu, meanwhile, now this is also very interesting. Because of the weaknesses of the Lebanese army and the UN peacekeeping forces in enforcing the ceasefire, he has pledged, and I suspect, or I am told it is also built into the agreement, to retain the freedom of military action to respond to breaches of ceasefire. So in his own words, Israel reserves the right to resume hostilities if Hezbollah rearms itself. So if moment they know that Hezbollah is getting rearmed to Iranian supplies either by sea or by land, Israel reserves the right to resume hostilities. If the Hezbollah resumes terror activities along Israel's northern border, Israel reserves the right to resume hostilities. If Hezbollah begins or recommences its tunneling activities, Israel reserves the right to resume hostilities. So, this is a very dangerous kind of ceasefire. If the Lebanese army and the UN peacekeepers don't or cannot enforce the ceasefire, Israel has said that it will enforce the ceasefire by itself. So judge, jury and executioner, that is another problem with the ceasefire. It is also a fact that the Hezbollah is a powerful part of the political landscape in Lebanon. So a new internal conflict in Lebanon, spate of assassinations may follow if the Lebanese government, led by Prime Minister Najib Mikati, attempts to constrain the Hezbollah unduly. Hezbollah is a powerful force, it will jockey for power, and if the non-Hezbollah factions try to constrain the Hezbollah unduly, there is going to be a lot of political bloodshed and assassinations, as has been the case in the past. The other problem with Lebanon is that 5 years of deep economic crisis and political paralysis. Because of this, the Lebanese state does not have the financial muscle to pay its soldiers, or even the political capital to meet the aspirations of various stakeholders. It is weak economically. It is divided politically. Lebanese soldiers subsist on a meager $100 monthly salary. Most of them moonlight as taxi drivers to supplement their incomes. So how will they fight? The Hezbollah operatives are paid far better. They have also penetrated the ranks of the Lebanese army. So the enforcer has been penetrated by one of the parties to the fight. So how will you ensure neutrality in the ceasefire? So the ability and capacity of the Lebanese army to act as a neutral arbiter and enforcer of peace is very suspect indeed. Just yesterday, the Speaker of the Lebanese Parliament announced January 9th as the date to elect a new Lebanese president, jolting the political deadlock that has persisted over the 2 years. 2 साल से ये फैसला नहीं हो पा रहा है as to how they will elect their Lebanese president. And now the date of election has been announced, 9 January. The Hezbollah would want to ensure that the incoming president is favorable to the resistance. So we could expect much political jostling between rival camps in the days and weeks to follow. And the key issue of political dissonance between various factions in Lebanese politics is whether the Hezbollah should be armed at all. So there are deep questions, very intractable economic challenges, equally grave political problems that remain. The Lebanese army is desperate for funding. There is a need for Arab and Western backers to finance the Lebanese military capacities for it to become good enough to enforce the ceasefire. Will such financing be forthcoming is, of course, a question that has no easy answers. During the ceasefire, the IDF will now have the time and operational space to focus on the Gaza front. it had its attention and resources were split along two fronts. Now it can focus exclusively on the Hamas while decoupling the Hamas from Hezbollah support. Now this is very significant. The Hamas had Hezbollah support as the IDF was carrying out operations in Gaza. There was this constant rocket fire and other stuff which was happening from the Hezbollah end. That worry, at least temporarily, is no longer there for the IDF. An isolated Hamas will find it harder to sustain the fight. It may therefore be forced to sue for a peace. So this ceasefire could also lead into a larger ceasefire with the Hamas in Gaza. In fact, as we speak, an Egyptian delegation is in Tel Aviv attempting to broker a similar ceasefire in Gaza. There is a larger ceasefire mechanism with an international tenor, which is also in place. A group of 5 composed of the USA, France, Israel, Lebanon, and the UN peacekeepers. Now, these may be, the neutral arbiters who could play a very critical role in enforcing the peace. The deal possibly has the blessings of President-elect Trump, and this, I think, is the most significant factor, who, while on the campaign trail in October, told his Lebanese American voters that he would end the war in their country. So it is an electoral promise which Trump has to live by. President-elect Trump has also given a missive to Netanyahu in private, end the war. Now, if the ceasefire has the backing of President-elect Trump, it has larger, possibilities of succeeding. And it has also been timed very well. So you have these 60 days of cessation of hostilities, ceasefire. It transits into the installation of President Trump as president into office. And so you may have this continuity into a larger peace. Accompanying developments in nearby Syria should also be of interest. You would have noticed that over the last 48-72 hours, there have been significant attacks by rebel groups against Syrian government forces in western Aleppo in Syria. Some say these attacks are assisted by Turkey, and the timing is curious because Syria, as we know, is a base, a bridge to the proxies, most notably to the Hezbollah. If the forces in Syria are not favorable to the Hezbollah and to Iran, the Hezbollah will not be able to sustain its operations into Israel. The Syrian government, President Assad, has also been helping the Palestinians in the West Bank. So Syria remaining under Iranian influence, under Hezbollah influence, is extremely significant in this whole game. If Israel extends its operational maneuvering to Syria, which it has been trying to do over the last few months, the Russians may come in with grim consequences because the Russians are not going to let any other influence come into Syria except their own. So, there are still problems there. It would seem to me that Israel's overall strategic position seems to have improved. You now have 2 major proxies degraded, Hamas and Hezbollah. They have been degraded. Iran has been constrained by the attacks carried out by Israel, even though, and this also has to be admitted, Israel's aura of invincibility, this perception that Israel could not be touched in operational strategic matters, that aura of invincibility has been punctured. So Israel's invincibility has been punctured. I think a strategic position is a little better than it was in October 2023. Now, with the war in Ukraine and Europe escalating majorly, a ceasefire in West Asia, howsoever brittle and fragile, and I have recounted all the reasons, is very welcome indeed. Because, the larger global escalations, Israel and Iran getting into a conflict, Russia getting sucked into West Asia, possibly China getting sucked into West Asia, and this replay of the proxy war in Europe and West Asia could have had very disastrous consequences for the globe. So in that sense, this de-escalation is, I think, a very bright spot. We may also be rest assured, that the pugilists the boxers have only retreated to their respective corners. for some rest and recoup, and will return to the fight very soon. What is more likely is a new operational modus vivendi between the IDF and the Hezbollah. So they will return to the fight, but with new plans, new concepts, and I don't think that, this will lay the basis for a lasting peace, though I hope it does. Unless, and I would repeat, unless, as I said, the ceasefire takes us smoothly, it doesn't break down in this intervening period, to the installation of Trump as the president, and the incoming Trump administration can push ahead on the wider Arab peace initiative, this accord between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and a Palestinian solution which is nestled in the framework of Israel's 1967 borders, which, given the current hostility, violence, lack of trust and bitterness, seems to be a very, very distant prospect. All that seems to be a very far cry, as I said, as of now, but hope must be eternal. That will be all for now. We shall be back with another episode on the subject if the ceasefire crumbles. Till then, goodbye, namaskar, Jai Hind.